to her biography. At least the thing I can say is that she's an extensive list of skills under her belt. But what was important to me to bring her here was that she was on the board of the American Medical Association when they introduced guidelines around high intensity lighting. So I'm going to leave it to you, Maya. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marnie. And actually, before I start, I just wanted to say a very special thank you to Marnie. This is not just her idea and intellectual force coming together, but she has just been incredible to work with on every level. Just always warm, kind, and so diligent with every detail. So I have to say, I've just been so thoroughly impressed by her, and I'm just thrilled to be here. She's really incredible. So before I begin, I just wanted to say how much of an honor it is to be here and join you. I think this is really an outstanding conference to bring together such diverse disciplines and groups of people to come and talk about this issue. And as Marnie said, my connection is I served on the board of the American Medical Association. I'll talk a little bit about that report at the end. And we had published several reports, but the report in 2016, which had to do with lighting, was especially controversial and I think very interesting as well in terms of trying to bring about some attention, awareness raising, but then also some changes in the lighting industry, at least in the US. So as a clinician, I'm a neurosurgeon, and you may be wondering, what does that have to do with lighting? I certainly wondered that at times, but I think it's very interesting when we think about traumatic brain injury patients. Light sleep is very important, and any sort of brain injury, sleep deprivation and sleep changes are very important. And I think increasingly we're thinking about light, not only in the influence of light in a negative way, but then also how can we use light as therapy. So there's a lot of space to think about it clinically, and so hopefully we can either get to that in the talk or in question and answer. But without further ado, I'll try not to duplicate what my colleague spoke about earlier. Maybe just hit a little bit of different points in terms of discussing the neuroanatomy of the eye. But I do think it's important because it provides a little bit of background before we kind of launch into why the AMA in particular was most concerned about LED lighting and blue light in particular. Again, not to belabor the point, but a schematic of the eye on the left-hand side of the screen. You can see here that light enters through the cornea. Now the iris is very important, helps accommodate and really decreases the aperture to help protect the back of the eye when there's bright light. And this is all reflexive. It's not something we control with higher order processes, which makes sense because evolutionarily you don't want to waste the time of having to think through these protective mechanisms. You just want to be able to react. So the light travels through, and the retina is really at the back of the eye. And this is a schematic that actually looks at the tissue layers of the retina. And what you can see here is that the photoreceptors, the rods and cones that you've heard about before, are in this retinal pigmented epithelium, which is in the back. So it's an inverted structure, which is unusual. You would expect the photoreceptors to be the most proximal to the light source, but in fact, they're the most distal, the most far away. So up top here, you can see this is another little cut of the back of the eye, which is the retina. And I'll talk a little bit about these cells in a second, but what's interesting is there's an area, it's called a fovea. You see that dip, that pit? You might have heard about the macula, the macular degeneration. We talk about that as a disorder. The macula is a specific region of the retina that is highly sensitive. It tends to have a very high light source comes into closer proximity to the photoreceptor rod phobia than it does at other portions of the retina. your RPE, your retinal pigmented epithelium. So these are the photoreceptors that we most often think about, the rods and cones. Rods are important primarily for dim light. Cones are important for color perception. Now, what's fascinating is obviously vision is highly complex. The ability to take light and to translate that into complex images is no small feat. And I certainly couldn't do justice to that in this talk, but just simplistically, you have this layer of rods and cones back here, and then you have a complex matrix of cells that help integrate and synthesize these signals. So the first layer are these bipolar cells that play a strong role in terms of trying to synthesize and summarize some of that information initially. And then you have a layer on top of that layer of these retinal ganglion cells. And it's the retinal ganglion cells that eventually, through their axons, which are really the terminals that nerve signals travel into the optic nerve, which eventually gets into the visual cortex and helps us process and have higher order processing of vision. Now, what's important about this region in particular is that there, as Professor Heim mentioned earlier, unique type of photoreceptor that was relatively recently discovered in the last several decades. It's called the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cell. It's uncommon, it's less than 5% of retinal ganglion cells, but it is a photoreceptor. So that kind of changed our thinking about photoreceptors, not just rods and cones helping us perceive images, but non-image forming photoreceptors. That is to say, really sensitive to light. So these IRPGs, these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, are very important because they sense light and they help us mediate some of these reflexive responses. So for instance, when we talk about circadian rhythm, when we talk about other issues such as decreasing the aperture of our iris to help limit damage with bright light, those are controlled by these non-image forming photoreceptors. So just to step back, we talk about LED lighting, and with the AMA report that came out in 2016, LED and the shift over to LED was really the impetus for why the report was drafted. So, and I'm using the US as a reference point because that's obviously where I'm most familiar, but prior to our report being released, we were making a dramatic shift like much of the world. Moving from quote unquote traditional forms of lighting to LED lighting for street lamps, parking, certainly indoor lighting. We think about smartphones, e-readers, tablets, all of that using LED as the dominant source. And so, a lot of it is driven by economics, which I think a lot of folks in the room can probably speak to much more clarity than I can. But essentially, much more cost effective, thought to decrease energy consumption. So those were the arguments that cities, municipalities were using in terms of dramatically shifting and trying to push forward this conversion to LED lighting. So as of 2014 in the US, street lighting, only about 13% at that time had been converted, but there were significant efforts to make that more rapid. And that effort was something that we wanted to discuss before it became 100% across the country. As I mentioned, what's interesting about LEDs in particular and how we get to blue light, our understanding is that for white light during LED, what the underpinning of that is there often is a blue source that's connected, coupled with a phosphor. And the phosphor over time bleaches and degrades. And this means that there's more blue light being emitted by white light emitting LEDs. And so thus that's our connection to the blue light as a problem narrative. And so, certainly in terms of indoor lighting, outdoor lighting, white light emitting LEDs are the most common. And the concern obviously is as the light source degrades, as this phosphor degrades, we're increasing the amount of blue light emissions. And so the question from our standpoint is, why is that important, and how might this impact the eye? So what's interesting is we have LED lights seeming to sweep across the US, becoming really the dominant light source. I was looking for a lamp the other day, and I couldn't find anything but LED lights in the store. We have LEDs, we have white emitting LEDs that use blue light in particular as their primary lighting source. And what's unique and interesting is if we step back to the neuroanatomy, those intrinsically photosensitive ganglion cells that I spoke to you about, the retinal ganglion cells, the less than 5% of IRPGs that help with non-image forming vision actually are uniquely sensitive to blue light at about 480 nanometers. So that's interesting, and these have been studied looking at different green, etc., seem to be very uniquely sensitive. So that helps make our connection in terms of, okay, well, we have visual receptors that seem most reactive to a certain wavelength of light. This wavelength is now predominating in terms of what we're able to access either for home use or for commercial use. So let's try to see what effect these blue lights might be having on human biology and physiology. So you heard a little bit about the different types of photopigments, and again, I don't want to get into the weeds, but historically, when you think about traditional photoreceptors, primarily mediate signal through protein rhodopsin. There's several other proteins involved, but rhodopsin has been characterized. What's interesting is there's another protein called melanopsin that is very important to retinal ganglion cells. And so the reason I mentioned melanopic content, and I'll get to this when I talk about the AMA report. When we talk about blue light, when we talk about LED light, we understand that not all LEDs and not all blue light within the spectrum is potentially harmful to the human physiology. After studies have looked at specific wavelengths and trying to understand even within the blue spectrum what may or may not be more or less harmful, our thought is, instead of saying LED bad, blue light bad, we want to step back and actually talk about the physiologic impact on the eye. So we use terminology such as melanopic content, because that's what we're getting to. We want to limit the stimulation and the rampant stimulation upon these cells, which are very important to human physiology. So I just say that as a lead into what I'll talk about in a future slide, but you might hear the term melanopic content. So we're just essentially trying to translate the terminology, make it less focused on sort of the lighting terminology and make it more focused on the physiologic impact that we're trying to avoid. All right, so we've heard lots of concerns, lots of worries about blue light. Certainly glare, disability, discomfort. You have these high beams coming at you on the roadway, especially if you're coming up here at night. It can cause a tremendous You've heard a little bit about electronic suppression, I'll talk about this through those slides. So we've certainly heard concerns about blue light in particular. And again, it seems to fit with what we know about physiology and anatomy, that blue light in particular elicits more disability glare than perhaps other wavelengths of light. So let me just briefly highlight. Older patients and trying to look at blue light treatment. And so what's interesting is, at the age our human brain is more developed. And so there have been some theories, some research groups speculated, where it might be that over time blue light transmission actually becomes part of cornea, etc., really serves as almost like filter. And so one thought is, you tend to see more often sleep disturbances in folks as they age. Or perhaps it has something to do with their blue light absorption during daytime, not allowing for proper sleep-wake cycles. So one group, Bayaki et al., actually looked at cataract extraction before and after to look at sleep quality and found that at least in a certain subgroup of patients, sleep quality tended to improve. The thought being more blue light was actually being absorbed during daytime hours and helped with sleep wake regulation. Another group, Sletton et al., reported that in older folks, again, acute exposure to blue light, and they looked at green light also, but green light didn't have the same effect. Blue light tended to decrease alertness and also suppress sleep and melatonin production compared to young people. So what's interesting about that study is twofold. One, they certainly looked at other wavelengths, at least in this case, green light, but they also tried to compare age groups. So you talked about elderly versus young. So certainly we can think about hormones, but we also think about just vision changing as we age. So it's important to think about subgroups of our population as well, because when we talk about light perception, we're not talking about a monotonous group of people. All right, and so just quickly, there's three generic mechanisms for light damage: photomechanical, that is a direct compression of damage to retinal cells, photothermal, energy absorption, and photochemical have enzymatic or intracellular processes. So, and I heard someone earlier mention oxidative mechanisms. In general, cell death has similar mechanisms across cells, whether you're talking about the retina or other parts of the body. And we do talk about oxidative changes and free radicals. And again, I don't want to belabor the point, but what's interesting is one enzyme in particular, which is superoxide dismutase 1, SOD1, which is found in other parts of the body as well, tends to help repair damage. And that's something we tend to lose, become less active as we age. So again, that sort of fits the overall narrative when we're talking about, for instance, macular degeneration, which we'll talk about in another slide. The question is, well, why are we seeing those perhaps more pressing effects of blue light if we believe that blue light is harmful in older patients versus younger patients? It may be the mechanism to help repair some of that damage isn't as robust. So getting back cellular level. I think it's always important to ask, obviously, tons of studies out there, and it's hard to know which ones do I believe, which ones do I not. I think it's always difficult to culture cells, a very sterile lab environment, because as we all know, there are so many parameters in the environment that help modulate vision in particular, and the cognitive perception of vision, that it's important to really have a sense of how it physiologically impacts it. There was also an interesting study. You probably have heard of lutein. Some people refer to lutein as a blue protective protein or element. And so one study actually looked at lutein administration and found, again, in cultured cells, that some retinal photo damage that had been observed actually improved. And so I'll just depart briefly. But looking at specific formulations, and they actually looked at lutein and zeaxanthin, and looked at different formulations, and seemed to find that at least in 26% of studies, increased risk of developing or progressing to age-related macular degeneration. And the formulation that was used in that group was 10 milligrams of lutein and then 2 milligrams of zeaxanthin daily. And so you can get that, assuming here, but I know in the US, you can get that as an eye supplement as well. I take it, I don't think it's harmful, but in terms of will this absolutely help you and prevent everything, I would never say that. So that's something you might see in the literature. Lutein as this great protective agent. It comes from that study, and again, needs more data to really solidify the story, but as far as I can tell, it's certainly not harmful. Let's see. Oh, so and then one other issue too is, as we were talking about, there have been some studies looking at blue light actually in different spectrums. So if, for instance, if you look at 470 to 490 nanometers versus 400 to 460, it tended to actually be less damaging. So again, when we are talking about the effect, when we talk about melanomic content, our goal from the clinical side is to say we want the safest lighting source. Understanding that we don't want to just state the narrative, blue light is evil or artificial light is evil. We want to make the lighting source as safe as possible for the human eye. All right. And I'll just briefly touch on this. Very important reflexes when you see light during the day gets to the eye. And there's an entire network within the brain. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, which actually lives right above the chiasm, where your optic comes across, and goes to really the deep portions of the brain. But the SCN, suprachiasmatic nucleus, is essentially the pacemaker of the brain, helps with a lot of oscillatory rhythms. And what's interesting is, the fiber tract and also the hormonal connections to the SCN are quite diverse. So you're talking about connections to the cortex, you're talking about connections to the pituitary gland, which houses many important hormones, very important for thyroid, really for cortisol. Multiple hormones are implicated in terms of the pituitary. You've heard about the pineal gland and melatonin, and also direct organ function. So for instance, liver, lung, kidney, other organ systems, and this is somewhat newer. We always thought that the end result of the SCN was to influence hormones, which in turn influence other hormones and had effects on the organs. But there might actually be some direct effects on organs. So if you think about it, livers, for instance, are very important for metabolism. And so if you think about sleep-wake, probably more efficient to allow your liver to rest or be less active enzymatically during the night than during the day. And so it makes sense that some of those important organ systems would also have an influence or relationship with the circadian rhythm. All right, so this is a study by Apple looking at two groups of patients. And what they were trying to do was actually either advance or delay their circadian phase. And so both groups of patients had individualized fixed 90-minute sleep schedules for 1 week. And so what was different in group one had 2 morning hours of short wavelength blue light, and then 3 evening hours of light restriction. Okay, that was group one. Group two had blue light for 3 hours in the evening and light restriction in the morning. So again, we were looking at blue light here, but we are not looking at eliminating blue light from the normal daily pattern. It was more the timing of this blue light. And so what was found is, not surprisingly, group one circadian phase advanced relative to group two. That is to say, having blue light at night tended to delay the patient's ability, or the study group's patient's ability to get to sleep. So it shows us that this story and this idea that blue light seems to uniquely have an impact in terms of, as you heard, melatonin, but then also sleep disruption seems credible. Just going to go a quick time check. Okay, perfect. Quickly, this is another study that, because again, we're talking about, well, we're moving to LEDs. This is bad. We got to, think about putting brakes on this. Well, what? It's the intensity in the LED that, and again, it has to do, as I understand it, from the white light that we have being dominant tool by blue light. And that's why the white carving on blue light has become more efficient now, but it has. So this is an interesting study looking at 2 groups of patients. So group one were actually exposed to a specific type of light. It was an LED, but blue depleted light. And group two was actually actually exposed to a standard fluorescent light. So both groups were exposed for 8 hours prior to bedtime, and then they actually switched over. So you can't make the argument that the two groups were different in some physiologic way. They actually switched over. And what was found was that compared to the fluorescent condition, the group with the blue depleted LED, their melatonin suppression was actually reduced. So again, suggesting that blue light in particular seems to be involved in that melatonin suppression. Subjective sleepiness was not different between the two groups, but what was interesting is auditory reaction times were still slower in the blue light depleted LED group compared to the standard fluorescent group, which is interesting. And honestly, it's difficult to explain because it doesn't really fit our narrative. If we think that blue light is implicated, if you deplete the blue light, then why would auditory reaction times be any different? So a little bit odd, and I think that's what happens when you obviously study human beings. You find results that don't fit, and that prompts further studies to actually try to understand what we found. And then also, I think what's interesting is you think about lab rats. We think about sterile lab conditions, you control for everything. There was actually a really interesting study just looking at when you allow rats to sleep. Because you turn on lights and you turn off lights in labs. And just shifting the time that the lights are off, for instance, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. versus midnight to 6 a.m., actually changes their physiology because it's when the lights are on, these animals will engage in more foraging behavior, more movement, more eating, feeding, and so that in turn may influence actually some of the study findings. So it's interesting to think about that even when we think about limiting and restricting in laboratory sterile conditions, who actually may have influences that you don't. I'll quickly talk about interactive tablets, smartphones, and again, if you think about the dominant light source for all of the monitors, and so this is an interesting study looking at a conventional LED smartphone versus a suppressed blue light smartphone. Those are the two groups. They had stimulation essentially from 7:30 to 10 p.m. And they were each tested in both groups. Again, it's crossover study designed to help eliminate any individual effects. So looking at melatonin and also looked at cortisol levels and body temperature. The patients were all subjected to a series of studies as well, looking at performance, mood, fatigue, sleepiness, etc. And so what was interesting is the blue light smartphones, those study subjects had significantly decreased sleepiness and increased cognition error, and they were given various tasks, performance-related tasks. And they also, not surprisingly, experienced a longer time to reach dim light melatonin onset. So again, it makes sense. Hormones don't react immediately. They tend to have a gradual effect. And so it's not just that you have the blue light that is stimulating the individual and you turn it off and magically you can sleep. There is a gradual delay that you have to factor in before you can return to a state where you're able to sleep. So this certainly was interesting, looking specifically at smartphones. And so now a lot of phones will have these settings that you can put on for nighttime. You can actually change the intensity. That's all very helpful. But I tell my patients, and I was joking with Marnie because I'm probably a big offender being a trauma surgeon. I'm usually up weird hours of the day and night. But I tell my patients, keep your iPhone, e-reader, etc. off for at least an hour before bedtime. It's hard to do for a lot of us because we always have to be connected, but it does help in terms of so blue light, understand that blue light, especially targets retinal ganglion cells, and those cells are very important in cycles. Important when we're talking about being alert and awake through the day and being drowsy and fatigued at night. It helps us regulate that cycle. And so what's interesting is if you look at conditions such as depression and anxiety, there have been some interesting studies where blue light is actually administered as therapeutic. And what's important, you know, if we think about blue light in particular, in depression, I should say, um, there are a lot of sleep disturbances. And so I think one area that's interesting to me is how much of it is related to, you know, truly organic psychiatric state versus you're dealing with a complex constellation of symptoms, including sleep changes, deprivation, etc. And so what blue light therapy is meant to do is say, okay, when you're awake during the day, from 8 a.m. to noon, let's say, or you're alert during the day, if we can stimulate that a level of awakeness and alertness and help restrict light later in the day, perhaps we can entrain better sleep-wake cycles. And this might actually influence depression, anxiety, etc. There's also an interesting study looking at fibromyalgia patients, again, having morning light exposure. So they were actually exposed to blue light, but during the morning, again, trying to entrain a good sleep-wake cycle. And actually, this group of patients was a small group, but they reported benefits, improved function, and also decreased pain sensitivity. Fibromyalgia is a condition of essentially diffuse pain and very difficult to treat. All right. So, but you know, I would say you're really the expert on this, but we heard a little bit about better shielding, certainly different things within the blue spectrum. I think there could be more research done to actually try to parse this out a little bit better. Smart lighting at night, consumption. Think about our use of off lights. I talked about sleep hygiene. I think that's very important. You know, blue light and light in general during the day is very important. I don't want to say that we should live in the dark, and I certainly don't think anyone else think that we should live in the dark all the time. But it's making sure that the nighttime is protected. And it's hard, you know, at night when you just have ambient lighting that's quite bright. That can be a huge source of difficulty, especially for patients with insomnia or diagnosed sleep disorders. So I think as best as we can encourage patients to try different lighting sources, keep away from the incredibly bright monitors, or try to decrease the intensity and make those dimmer, the better for sleep. Eye strain, we're looking at computer screens. You'll hear different recommendations, but I think every half an hour or so, try to focus on a distant object and then try to return to whatever you're trying to do. Eye strain is certainly an issue. And if you think about it, just keeping your iris contracted for a period of time, there are complex muscles that help with ciliary movements, etc. And those can strain, just like, you know, your arm gets strained if you're holding something in your hand for a long time. So just try to exercise, I would say, as many braces as reasonable. We mentioned lutein, zeaxanthin. It's the 10 milligram, 2 milligram formulation that was found in ARIDS 2 daily. All right, so very the American Medical Association was founded back in 1847. The House of Delegates meets twice a year. All the special societies represent all the states. It's quite diverse. They're all of the all specialties. And the AMA can meet twice a year, as I mentioned, and it's really a policy body. And so individuals can come forward and say, I want to study this issue. How do I, you know, go about this? There's a resolution process, and eventually these studies are made. And so this is how the emphasis on light actually was generated. We have a cardiologist who's a member, who's an astronomer on the side from New England, and actually was very interested in dark skies, and said, we're doing a lot with light pollution, but we're not talking about the health effects, so let's study it. So in 2012, report, talk about light pollution, etc. I don't think anyone's read it. That was 2016, the report was revised, updated, incredibly controversial. I think we got a million a week or so of it being released, and all kinds of press. I mean, it was just insane. Any help, no one reads it. I mean, this we got a lot of pushback, see that on their models and their replicas, etc. But our report was really meant to raise awareness. And in talking to these various groups in terms of the criticism, I think some of the criticism was fair in terms of the scale we used. We used color correlated temperature, and some industry experts said, look, that's not a great scale to use. We understand. I think what we wrestled with, and we talked a little bit about this the other day, is at what point do you make aware the public of concern? We're shifting rapidly to LED light. We're shifting rapidly to LED light. We don't want to wait 30 years and then tell people, guess what? We changed all the lighting sources and you might actually have a lot of harm from it, sorry. So we always balance with how much, we're never gonna get perfect information. But we wanna make people aware, we wanna start the discussion. And we understand this is a moving target. Lighting every day is changing, it's evolving. And if we can influence the technology up front, we thought that we could provide value. So I just want to be clear, we're not in the business of quackery and dumb science, but we wanted to say, look, we don't know. We don't fully understand the effects of blue light and LEDs, but we want to raise caution because we're making this transformational shift. And it's better we do that now than later. All right. So just quickly, we were supportive of LED lighting, but we had and then we also talked about community-based process where community input is solicited and that community involvement can be rendered. So in 2017, a lot of pushback, there were good meetings though with industry and the Transportation Safety Board, police groups, and all kinds of things. So we tried to come back and say, look, we still think this is important. Maybe we got some of the metrics and things that we suggested wrong, and there might be better metrics. Instead of color correlated temperature, tell us what would be better. But what you see is what we distance. We talked about the effect, physiological effect. We want the melanopsin, i.e., the effect on the retinal ganglion cells to be safe. What that makes it hard, I would say, for industry to deal with, what does that mean? 3,000 Kelvin actually gives a target. What's that? And completely sensitive to that. So we're still trying to work and figure that out. But from our standpoint, we were trying to make it from at least the physiology standpoint. We're not just saying this is bad. We're not just saying 3,000 is an absolute. We just want to get to the thing that's the safest, the level that's the safest for the eye. So it's a work in process, I would say. All right, and then I mentioned there. But again, I think the enemy of good is perfect, as we always say. So we wanted to come up with information first, and we can worry about making it perfect. So. So anyone got something from Maya? Hey, okay, Fred, you started. And that's what's interesting because at least the data I'm familiar with looks at 480 as the maximally sensitive point, which is right in that range. So I would say it's a work in process. We're still trying to understand. It's challenging. There are obviously some parameters when you're culturing and isolating those cells and subjecting them to light directly and studying that. And I think you see some effects that you probably don't see in a human who has those SOD1 and can sort of clean up some of those damage mechanisms. But I don't have a good answer for you. It's interesting because clinically it seems like that range is safer. But then if you look at the cellular level, it's maximally sensitive. So,
Is it safe on daytime or at night?
I think in general daytime. Yeah, because again, you're trying
Like the
to,
sun.
you're trying to entrain those sleep-wake cycles to be regular. Yeah.
One of the things that when we start talking about temperature, and we are playing with changing or reducing the blue light by phospho compound.
Yeah.
Now the problem is you put a setting of LED in the street, and no one looks.
Right.
5 years, 2 years later, if the compounds are changed and are modified. And do we have really a way of testing? And municipalities are doing it because we are exposed. When the LED was set, it was okay.
Right.
But 2 years later, it can be a risk.
Yeah, I
How
know
do
exactly. Yeah, no, and I certainly am not the expert, so I'm going to punt to whoever can answer that. But you're exactly right. I think the
No,
public
but this
doesn't
is to
know
do
that.
with
Yeah.
legislation.
Yeah.
I mean, if you come and you give a recommendation,
Right.
one of the recommendations should be that the luminaires should be tested once in 2 years. And if they are not working well, so it should be removed.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point. I think with the, hopefully future iterations of the report, because we plan to revise it every so often or every few years, can hopefully capture that. But I think that's exactly right. At least from us from the political side, it was a surprise to even think that these light sources that were touted as, you never have to change your light bulbs again, were actually degrading. I mean, that was
100,000
novel, at least for
hours.
me. Yeah. Well, it was novel, right? And I think the lay public probably doesn't understand that. And absolutely, we want to build awareness first, but then move towards, well, we should be checking these.
This is a great idea.
Yeah.
I think that the two, in 2012, it was also very important.
Yeah.
Because it came and said we have a problem with
Right.
light at night, which is light pollution. No one really spoke
Yeah.
about it in such a way. Then in 2016, we went to the communities,
Yeah.
and maybe we don't need to change, maybe we stay with what we have.
Sharon, did you have a question?
It's more of a comment. So I've spoken to lighting engineers, and I always invoke what you tell them is what you do.
Yeah.
And so I use UV and sunscreen as my way of explaining to why a particular section of light is actually important. I just wonder if that's kind of a narrative that we could build upon. We all know that we said, particularly in Australia, we cover your sunscreen, we know it wears out over time.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's a similar analogy, and I wonder if we can start building that into our narrative to try and, because I get another idea. I'm a
Yeah.
biologist, right? But, I think it's really tricky, and so it's got to be easy to using all the time and can start thinking about and making your own analogies. But that's one I've used, and that has some effectiveness.
Yeah.
Probably
that's great.
specifically for Australians, so we're
Yeah, that's right.
it's intense.
Yeah, but I'm from the UK, but. Yes, thank you.
No, I think that's a great analogy.
I have a question about, only because recently I had to go to one hardware store with white light, and they're like 2 million different types. And there were white LEDs and yellow LEDs. I can't remember what the other one was. So this, what you presented today, is that just for white LEDs, or what about the yellow face?
In terms of the potential harm? or-
Yeah.
So that's a good question. So my understanding is that the white, so in terms of the source for the white light emitting or
Yeah.
appearing is predominantly blue and phosphor. And I'll be very honest, I know that the technology is evolving rapidly, and I'm certainly not an expert or have even a minimal understanding of all the different types of LED lights. I think more my concern is, so I went to the store in the US recently to try to get a floor lamp, and it's very difficult. You don't have transparency in terms of what exactly are the spectral properties. So I think to your question, it might say this is yellow or this is orange, this is safer, but how do we know? Is it still that blue light source? Because that seems to be a problem. And if it's degrading with this phosphor, that's still a problem. So I'm skeptical when I see that, because I don't have enough information to make an informed judgment. But I can't answer your specific. Yes, yeah, it is stressful, yes. But in terms of that, I don't know specific.
If I could just make a point on that, and I'm no expert on anything. I can run a conference basically. But I think what's important is that if you do go to the hardware store and you start asking these questions, have you got a warm code light? I've heard about this. And because what's going to happen, in my opinion, is this is going to be the plastic bag movement. But as we start talking, as we go to our hardware store and ask for the right lights, they might not know the answer, but if everyone keeps asking, that's where we start getting a bit of
I'm not sure who knows.
We don't. I think that's the question. That's the point.
Tim knows.
Okay. Tim. And that'll be our last question.
There are two things
Yeah.
I asked about, so
Yeah.
just to fill you
Oh,
in
yes,
some of the
please.
detail. Okay. The reason why you have blue as the base for LED is they looked, when they were going to LED, they looked at red and green and amber and blue. And blue had the slowest rate of decline in light output of the primary source. All the others had rather dramatic, so there was no point in having them at the light source that was supposed to last a long time. So blue became the base, and then adding blue and yellow light together makes white. And yes, the problem is the phosphorus grade, but the really good quality LED, they look at the temperature that the phosphorus is exposed to minimise that degradation. But a lot of LEDs these days are just mass produced and they've forgotten about that. But the other thing I wanted to just to mention to you when you were talking about metal.
Yeah.
Okay. But there is the standard that's come out of the United States, which you're probably aware of. It's WELL, W-E-L-L, right? It's promoting lighting mainly in interior spaces, but it's promoting the use of blue light from the point of therapy about its melanoptic content and how it contributes to the health of the occupants. But it's much more difficult to manage.
Right.
And people are still struggling to come to grips with that. So there is movement forward in regard to this.
Absolutely. No, I thank you for bringing that up. Yes. But again, it's like you mentioned, the translation to make it useful so that you can actually act on it. That I think this is
One last comment.
I think that you raised here a very important point. Is that the expert that tells us what to use and what not to use is the salesman in the home center.
Yeah.
And he is now the expert.
Yeah.
He is the expert. He knows everything. And back at home, we have the light organization. And one of the things we do is we bring these people and we train them. And now they say, no, we didn't know. But this is what we are advising people to buy. This is what they were telling us.
One really quick point to that, when you're going to buy bulbs and light, run light as well. So there's color temperature and then there's color rendering. Color rendering is how the light spectrum renders properties that you can see clearly. So if you look at the older sodium lights, they have full yellow spectrum. So everything you see is quite yellow. Where LED has a broader spectrum, so you can see things more clearly. So on those little bulbs that you buy, they should also have they often use ARI now, but they are also talking about 1030. We tested against different test samples. So often the previous LEDs, when they first came out, had high pinky waves, and there wasn't much spectrum in some colors. Now I've got some of mine that they've got much bluer spectrum, which then you sort of get that balance. So ARI 95 is much better. That might be one. What, sorry?
ARI 90 or above, and 3000 Ks. Probably good balance.
We've got lots of time to talk about this, so thank you. Please.